Story 1. I was looking for silence, that solitude I had been missing for the last few years. The hustle and bustle of the city, the constant rush, the noise, the people, all of it was just burning me out. I was tired. So when I was offered this house, I knew right away that it was what I needed. A small house in rural Maine, away from civilization, with its own lot and an old forest behind it. It was perfect, or at least I thought so. The house was old. It was obvious that it hadn't been repaired for many years, much less updated. The floorboards creaked, the walls bore the marks of time, and the windows didn't let in the light like they used to. But for me, it was like a promise. I would take care of this house myself. I would tidy it up, make it a place where I could just relax, get rid of everything unnecessary, where I could forget about everything. When I arrived, I immediately got to work. I removed the trash, stripped away the old paint, tried to restore the house to its former glory. But I quickly realized that every corner here was more than just old. It was something more. Even the air here was special, as if the house itself held secrets. But I was determined. None of this mattered because there was a new life ahead. I was starting from scratch. The first days in the house were spent in the shadow of constant work. I cleared the area, cut back the bushes that tidied up the space. The forest, almost touching my yard, seemed alive and wild, and I liked it. There were no people in it, only trees, grasses, and hidden secrets. One day, while clearing an area near the edge of a forest, I came across something hard. At first, I thought it was a rock. I picked up the shovel to try digging again, but there was an object with sharp angles in the ground. Not a rock, not something natural. It was metal, with angles that didn't look like rock at all. I continued digging and soon pulled a rusty box out of the ground. It was covered in a layer of dirt and leaves, and the leather strap that was tied around it had long since rotted away. I removed it, trying to be careful not to damage the contents. Inside was a Polaroid camera, old, battered, but in surprisingly good condition. I didn't know why it was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was also an undeveloped photograph in the box. It was blank, with no image. I looked at it, hoping to find some clue as to who might have left the camera there, but I couldn't find anything that would explain its presence in such a remote place. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take the camera home with me. I put it on the table and started cleaning it. I gave it a chance. I inserted a new film cartridge. I didn't expect anything unusual. Maybe it was just an old camera that someone had forgotten many years ago. I decided to take my first photo just for the test. It was a kitchen. I took aim for a moment and pressed the button. I immediately saw the film start to pull out of the camera. When the photo developed, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was my kitchen, but not the one I knew. My kitchen was plain, a little worn, with burnt countertops and outdated shelves. But the picture showed a completely different kitchen. The countertops were glossy granite. The floors were light and new. The walls were clean, unworn, as if they had just been renovated. And the strangest thing was that there was a woman in the picture, standing at the sink. Her head was slightly turned, her hair pulled back. I was alone in the house. There was no way anyone else could be there. I put the camera down. Doubt slowly began to creep in. Was this a joke? Was this a photo that someone had inserted into the camera before it was buried? My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. I picked up another cartridge and decided to try again. I took this picture in my living room, testing the camera again. I caught a moment when the light was coming through the window and took a picture to see how everything looked. In the developed picture, I saw my living room again, but with different details. The furniture was different, beautiful, modern, comfortable, and something else. A man was sitting in a chair, reading a book. It was not me. I tried to justify myself by thinking that it could have been one of the previous owners of the house, but everything was getting stranger. I looked at the picture, and everything around me began to seem not so real. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was more than I could understand. I tried taking pictures again. I took a few shots outside, pointing the camera at the forest. I was sure that these were just memories of what I saw around me. But every time I developed the photo, the houses I lived in looked different in the pictures. The furniture was better, the walls were brighter, and the people in the photos were complete strangers. Something was wrong here. But I kept looking for an explanation, collecting more photos, not knowing that I was getting too caught up in it. At night, when I almost didn't believe in my ability to understand what was happening, I decided to take one last picture for the night. A picture of my bedroom. Silence. A picture. It was as usual. But this was no longer an ordinary night. In the photograph, when it developed, I saw myself sleeping in bed, and something was standing in the corner. From the moment I saw that photograph, everything began to change. The fear I had tried to ignore began to grow, like cracks in an old wall. I remembered thinking I was just taking a picture of my bedroom, trying to capture the morning light and shadow. But what I saw in the picture was impossible to ignore. I was in my place, in my bed, and next to me in the dark corner. There was something. It was tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. Something I couldn't quite make out, but I knew it was there. I felt its presence. I sat there for a long time, looking at the photograph, including what I hadn't seen then. The picture wouldn't go away, nor would the darkness that enveloped me as I looked at it. It was cold, and though I tried to convince myself that it was all just the result of my own imaginary anxiety, I couldn't think that way any longer. I felt the unease creeping deeper into me, as if the room itself were becoming cramped and uncomfortable. I glanced at the camera on my desk, its gleam calling to me. For the next few days, I tried to avoid the camera. I didn't want to take any more pictures, didn't want the world to become distorted again, but my thoughts wouldn't let go. I tried to focus on my new home, on tidying it up, getting rid of old things, and creating something new. But every time I was alone, I felt the cold presence of something else, the thing in the photograph. The next morning, I realized that my efforts to bring order to my home were haunting me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been in the woods beyond the backyard, where children had probably played or animals had run. I decided to go out there, feel the dirt under my fingernails, embrace those woods again. I needed to take back control, because what if this was all just a fantasy? The forest greeted me with silence. No noise, no sound, no breeze. I walked along the path, bumping into a few old branches that creaked under my feet. Even the air here was thick, as if the forest absorbed all sounds and its shadow covered everything. I walked closer and closer to the edge of the forest, to the same area where I found the camera. It was not so dark here, but the forest still beckoned with its dark magic. I stopped to look around, but soon noticed something strange. Along the edge of the forest, just behind the bushes, stood something like an old swing. When I first passed by here, it was gone, and now it stood, creaking with age, as if someone had used it very recently. I felt cold. I did not want to come closer anymore. I walked further, and that's when I noticed something strange. In a place where there was nothing before, a small hut appeared. It was hidden behind the trees, almost invisible, but I clearly saw the outline of log walls and an old roof covered with moss. My steps slowed and my breathing became deep. I came closer, but as soon as I was a few meters away from this place, I felt how everything around became too quiet, very quiet. It was as if the forest was waiting. I walked around the hut trying to peer through the windows, but they were boarded up, and there was no gap to see through. My fingers felt cold as I touched the door, but I didn't dare go in. It was time to go home. Maybe I was just too tired. I decided not to think about this place, not to go back to it, but deep down I knew this was no accident. Meanwhile, back home, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself that all of this was just my imagination, the thought that I had seen something in that photograph, and now I had stumbled upon a strange hut, wouldn't leave me, as if it were all connected, and I didn't know what to do with this knowledge. The next morning I picked up the camera again. There was a challenge in my soul. I couldn't allow myself to be afraid. I couldn't leave it without an explanation. I pointed the camera outside, photographing the forest again, trying to be objective. I pressed the button again and waited for the photo to develop. This time, when the picture appeared, my heart sank. The photo showed my street, my trees, but something was wrong. In the background where there was nothing stood a hut. It was the same hut, but in the crack in the wall, there was a figure, a tall creature, like a man, but with unnaturally elongated limbs. It stood in the shadows watching me, and it was closer, much closer than in the pictures I had taken before. I didn't know what to do. My body froze with fear, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Fear was my constant companion. I couldn't shake it. Despite everything I tried to rationalize, I knew something was wrong. That picture of the figure standing outside the hut haunted me. It wasn't just captured in the camera. It was there, in reality where I stood, and I couldn't figure out what it was. An ancient creature or just my imagination, distorted by fear? I didn't know. I spent the next few days trying to ignore these thoughts, but they wouldn't leave me. The forest was becoming more and more hostile. I couldn't go out there anymore without feeling like something was watching me. Every movement in the bushes, every rustle of the wind seemed strange, as if the forest itself was watching me, as if it was hiding something. But I continued to spend my days in the house, working on its renovation, to avoid thinking about what was happening in that forest. One evening, when I was sitting at the table again and processing another photo, I noticed something strange. The camera started taking pictures by itself. I didn't press the button, but when I turned it, the camera was already ready for the next shot. It was impossible. I felt an icy chill run down my spine when I saw the new picture. It was my living room, exactly as I had left it that day. But next to the window in the corner stood a figure. It wasn't just a shadow or a distorted shape. It was a creature, like a man. But its features were too blurry, its contours too indistinct. I knew this figure was in the photograph before I even touched the camera. I didn't know how to explain it, but one thing became clear to me. I was not alone. I decided to go back into the forest. For some reason, I felt like I was missing something, like something important was hiding right in front of me. I picked up my camera again to take pictures of the places where I couldn't find answers. With every step in the forest, my heart beat faster and my breathing became shallower. It seemed like with every step I took, I was getting closer to something I couldn't understand. This time I headed to the place where I had seen the cabin in the photo. I was sure it was there somewhere, even though in reality I found nothing but dense forest. Perhaps the cabin was disappearing, or maybe I had only seen it in the photo. But the camera doesn't lie, and I felt that if I searched long enough, I would find something. I walked for hours. The forest was dense and dark, almost devoid of life. Only the occasional sounds of birds broke the silence. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, I saw no one. At one point, I almost lost track of time. But then, after a few turns and confusing paths, I saw it. A small hut stood in front of me, hidden by thick trees. It was exactly the place I had seen in the photo. But something was missing. The hut looked old and abandoned, covered in moss and devoid of any life. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Just an empty space, like something from a nightmare. I moved closer and began to examine the place, but I found nothing. All I saw were old boards that were barely hanging on each other and cracks filled with sand and leaves. I began to take pictures almost automatically, taking pictures of every corner, every crack. The camera began taking pictures again without my intervention. I felt a chill as I saw that each new picture showed a place that was no longer as I had seen it. In one of the pictures, the hut was in much better condition. The walls were clean and the roof was intact. There was a table with cups inside and rugs on the floor, and as usual, there were people I didn't know. A man in dark clothes was standing by the window and a woman was sitting at the table, staring into space. In the next picture, things were even stranger. It was the same interior, but now the hut was full of people, all of them staring straight at the camera with empty, lifeless eyes. I felt something freeze inside me. Those eyes, they were too real, too alive. I quickly hid the camera, trying to convince myself that it was all just a trick of light and shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important hidden in these strange images. I looked around and noticed something that wasn't there before, a small path leading into the forest. I couldn't help but feel that it was leading me somewhere. Maybe this time I would find the answer. I didn't know why, but I had to go there. The path was hidden in the undergrowth, and I picked my way along it carefully, feeling something around me tighten with each step. I walked deeper and deeper into the forest, and at one point I thought I heard something, soft, barely audible. It was the sound of footsteps, but strange, as if someone was walking on soft ground, leaving no tracks. I stopped listening, and a moment later I heard the sound again. It was close, too close. I turned around again, but this time I saw something that made me freeze. A figure stood in the dark trees. It was blurry, as if its outline was dissolving into the darkness, but I could clearly see it was there. Tall, thin, with long arms that hung to the ground. I felt my heart pounding and fear seeping into every cell of my body. She took a step and another. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but when I got back to my house, I felt the walls closing in around me. My breathing became heavy and my thoughts became confused. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I was not alone, and whatever was lurking in the forest wasn't going to let me go. The next day, I woke up feeling like everything that was happening around me was just part of a nightmare. But when I looked at the Polaroid camera again, reality became distorted again. The same picture of the cabin I had taken the day before now showed something else. A forest. Just a forest. No cabin, no path, no figure standing in the dark trees. But I knew it couldn't be true. The camera didn't lie. I sat at the table, my head in my hands, trying to figure out what was happening. Why was everything around me changing? Why did I keep seeing the same things, but in different versions, each one feeling real? I felt like something important was slipping away from me, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Trying to collect my thoughts, I looked again at the first photo I'd taken with my camera. An empty photo that was now dark, the same forest, but this time, something was different. I suddenly realized that I had to go back into the forest, but not to where I had already been, not to where the cabin was hidden. I had to go back to the place that had remained unchanged in all the pictures. It was something special, something that gave me clues, but at the same time avoided direct explanation. I took my camera and headed into the forest. This time I was sure I would find the answer. The path I had seen yesterday seemed important, and I knew it would lead me somewhere. I walked through the thick trees, looking around every now and then to make sure I wasn't missing anything important. I was scared, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't leave this thing undone. I kept moving until I came to what seemed like a cliff, the edge of an old quarry. It was a strange place, but it seemed familiar to me. I walked to the edge, peering down. Below was a dark cave entwined with tree roots. I knew I had to go down there. That was the moment I realized I was afraid not only of what might be down there, but also of the fact that I would keep going anyway. It was dark inside the cave, but I didn't need light to see that there was something there. I felt my legs growing heavy, each step making me lose confidence. And then, when I was almost to the end, I saw them, stones lying in a dark corner. But not just stones. They were human figures. They were sitting on the ground, motionless, as if they were waiting. I knew I couldn't get any closer, but I couldn't leave. I took a picture. And again, something had changed. A new figure appeared in the photograph. It was a woman sitting among the rocks, as if she were part of this place. But unlike the people I had seen before, she was not empty. Her eyes were looking straight into the camera. It was a look of horror, as if she was trying to tell me something, but couldn't. My heart sank with fear. I ran without looking back, without thinking about what was around me, what was happening to my feet, which seemed to be stuck in the ground. I returned to the house, closing the door behind me. This place, this cave, all this had to be part of some ancient mystery, but I did not know how to solve it. This time I couldn't bring myself to pick up my camera. I knew I couldn't just take pictures and wait for the answers to come. Something had to change. Otherwise, I might become part of what I was seeing. Only one thought came to mind. I had to find someone who could help me. But who in this forest could help me understand what I was seeing? These changes, these mysteries. Then I knew. I needed to find the one who came before me, the one who lived in this house, someone who could explain to me why these photos were manifesting so strangely and what this forest really hid. I remembered the box I had found the camera in. Was it part of some old secret ritual, or was this all some kind of warning that I had failed to understand correctly? But the answers didn't come, and all that was left was to return to the forest, to the cave, and seek the truth, even if it consumed me. Night came faster than I expected. Darkness was creeping into my house, swallowing its walls, and I felt like this forest outside the windows was watching me. It was alive, filled with tension, as if every tree and bush was whispering something in my ear. I sat in the chair, holding the camera in my hands, but I didn't look at it once. My head was spinning around one question. What if I've already gone too far? What if that forest and all these strange things are not just a paranormal joke, but something deeper, more dangerous? On the table was a photograph taken yesterday. It was of a woman in a cave. I couldn't forget her eyes. She was looking straight at me, as if she knew I would make the next move. What if she was one of those who had once been here and was stuck in this place? What if this camera, these photographs, were all part of some larger plan, a vicious circle that I was caught in? I stood up and went to the window to try to see something in the darkness. There was no sound in the forest. I felt the air become heavy, as if the air itself was some kind of monster that was creeping up on me with every breath. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay home or go back into the forest? But I was drawn there. I knew that only there, among those dark trees, would I find some answers. I took the camera. This time I couldn't put it off any longer. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something more. Something that was haunting me. I opened the door and stepped into the dark night. The forest greeted me with silence again. But now everything was different. There was no usual night silence around me. Instead, there was only noise in my head, the noise of thoughts that did not give me peace. I walked, and with each step, I was overcome by the feeling that I was no longer in this world. Almost like in some kind of labyrinth where all roads lead to the same place, to the unknown, to what awaits me. Hours had passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't figure out who or what it was, but I felt it in every cell of my body. Every tree, every bush, every sound seemed to be part of something great and sinister. I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. I knew I was close to something important. Something was about to happen. And then, as if an invisible hand was pulling me to that very place, to the cliff, to the quarry, to the cave. When I approached the edge, I did not see what I expected. The cave had disappeared. Instead, I saw only a black, bottomless emptiness, as if the earth had simply swallowed everything around it. I took a step back, but felt my feet slipping on the rocks, and I lost my balance. I was falling, but at that moment something grabbed my hand. It was cold, like ice, but at the same time some invisible force held me back, preventing me from falling into the void. Looking to the side, I saw someone looking at me. There was a silhouette in the darkness. A woman, the same one I had seen in the photograph. She was standing in the place where the cave used to be, looking at me. Her eyes were the same, full of pain and fear. But now I saw that there was a shadow on her face, something dark that did not allow her to move. I took a picture. This time it was different. The camera didn't develop the image right away. It started to show it as if the image was trying to break through the dark fabric. I waited until the picture developed completely, and when it did, I saw myself. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, but I was not alone. Behind me, in the very shadows, there was something huge and dark, like fog or a cloud, but not a cloud. It was like something from another world. It moved, but it left no trace. And when I looked at it, I realized that it was following me. It had always been behind me, but now I could see it. At that moment, I was overcome with terror. I turned and ran. I couldn't think. I just ran. All I had to do was get back into the house, close the door, and barricade myself. But no matter how hard I ran, the dark creature was there. I could feel its breath, its presence, as if it was always behind me, watching, lying in wait. Finally, I reached my house, closed the doors, and locked the windows. Breathing hard, I grabbed the camera and looked at the last photo again. But instead of seeing my bedroom, I saw the same forest. And in this picture, I was standing as always, but this time I was not alone. A creature dark and huge was standing right behind me. I couldn't tear myself away from the photograph. It was there, and now I knew it was watching me, that I couldn't escape. And maybe this was the beginning of the end. When I woke up, it was early morning, and light was streaming through the window, filling the room with a soft golden glow. It was the same light that was in all the photographs I had taken with the Polaroid camera. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened since I found the camera had been no accident. Those strange pictures, the figures disappearing and reappearing, the shadows at night, it all seemed part of something much bigger now than I could have imagined. I lay in bed, my mind racing. Every moment I felt something elusive, alien, standing behind me. A being that was watching me. A being that had always been there, but only now did I realize it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that all of this had happened before. Could this be a curse? A story that was repeating itself over and over again? Or was I part of a game in which man's role had been foretold in advance? I quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake up all those worries and fears that tormented me at night. I went to the window and looked out into the yard. The sun had not risen high, and the forest outside the window seemed misty and alive, almost as if it were hiding something. I remembered all those nights I had spent here, all my steps in the forest, all the mysterious photographs I had taken, and that strange feeling that I knew what would happen next. I picked up the camera again. It was lying on the table as if waiting. I had to understand. I couldn't bear to hold this unknown weight on my shoulders any longer. What kind of game was this? Who or what was controlling the events? And why was all this happening to me? The camera felt heavier in my hands than before, but I couldn't let it go. It was a part of me. I decided to take another picture. This time I chose a corner that was always in the shadows, which I hardly paid attention to. I stood next to the window, pressed the button, and the picture began to develop. I watched the process as the film slowly revealed the picture in front of me. And when the image was finished, I realized this was not what I expected. I saw myself, but in this photograph, I wasn't alone. There was a shadow behind me, a shadow that never left me. The creature that always followed me stood next to me. It was here, in my home, in my life, and it wouldn't leave. But here was the strange thing. It didn't look menacing. It wasn't sinister. On the contrary, it seemed to be watching me with some incredible care, and in its dark features, I saw a familiar face, the face of a woman I had seen in old photographs, in whom I could almost recognize now. She wasn't alien. She was like me. I felt that she belonged in this world, that she wasn't from another time, or another dimension. She was a part of me, as if I were connected to her, like two halves of a whole. I felt everything around me begin to change. The forest outside my window no longer seemed so scary. My home was no longer a dark and empty place. This was the world I knew, the world I was in for a reason. I knew that I could no longer escape what was about to happen. Looking at the photograph, I realized again that there was more to it. In the very corner, in the deepest shadow, I saw something new. There stood a creature, much larger than I had ever imagined. It was dark, majestic, and seemed not just a figure, but the shadow of the forest itself, and it was approaching. I put the camera down on the table, unable to look at these pictures any longer. I knew I had to go back into the forest, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready for it. I closed my eyes and breathed in. At that moment, I realized that something had changed inside me. I was no longer a stranger to this world, to this forest. I was a part of it, just as it was a part of me. Maybe I'll never find the answers to all the questions that have tormented me. Maybe this forest and these photographs will always be with me, but I don't feel afraid anymore. I know what I have to do, and that maybe this is all I needed to understand. And when I go out into the forest again, I won't be alone. Maybe this wasn't the end, just the beginning. Story 2. Bridgetown. If you drive past the old town hall and turn left at the dairy farm on the riverbank, you'll come to the old bridge. It's not a popular place with the locals, except for those who live in the darkest corners of town. It wasn't pretty or particularly notable, but that night it was more than that. It was something I needed to find, even though I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for. I didn't feel alive those days. My life had become an endless stream of days that merged into one dull blur, devoid of meaning. My parents, whom I had once loved, were now strangers to me. They argued endlessly. It became a familiar background, an inseparable companion of our evenings. Their fight about what was and what wasn't, about who was to blame for what happened to Jamie, my brother, my only brother, who was no more. His death was the event that divided our home forever. My whole life had changed so much in 2 months that I couldn't even remember when we were happy. I couldn't remember when we laughed. I couldn't remember when Mom and Dad really talked and didn't yell at each other. I didn't know how to live in this painful emptiness. I sat in my room, listening to their argument grow louder. Sometimes I found myself wishing they would just disappear. Mom and Dad, whatever was left of their love was long gone, and I couldn't watch them fall apart any longer. I couldn't watch my life fall apart any longer. So when they started arguing again that night, I just got up, cracked the window, and slipped out into the night. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it resonating in my ears. My legs felt like lead, but I still made my way out of the house and down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. My bike was in its place, ready for anything. I got on it and rode into the empty night, not knowing exactly where I was going. Just somewhere, away from everything I knew. After 2 hours, I finally reached the bridge. It stood there like a ghost, abandoned and hidden in the night, surrounded by trees and thick bushes that were so dark they looked like black spots against the even darker sky. The bridge wasn't old, but it looked like it belonged to a long-forgotten time. A few street lamps dimly illuminated it, but there wasn't enough light to make it look cozy. I stood on the bridge, leaned my bike against the railing, and sat down on the ground. I waited. At first, nothing happened except for the soft rustling of the wind that played with my hair. I looked at the dark waters of the river that flowed slowly under the bridge, which seemed to me as calm and endless as my life. The minutes dragged on. I didn't know what I expected to find here, but the feeling that I was doing something important clung to me. Maybe I was looking for a way to leave, to find closure, to end this torture in my life. Maybe I was hoping that, despite everything they said about vampires, I might see something that would bring me relief. Or maybe I was just looking for a sign that would tell me that things weren't so bad, that there was a way out. And then, in that silence, when time seemed to stand still, I heard footsteps. Light, but distinct. It was not an ordinary sound, but something strange and unnatural. I raised my head and saw a figure. There was nothing alive in its silhouette. Pale skin, a black leather cloak intercepted at the shoulders. I could not see its face, but the ears. They were large, pointed like an elf's, strangely long, sharply outlined, and they stuck out from under the hood, like an animal's. I felt a sharp uneasiness. It was what I was told as a child, those stories about vampires we were afraid of. I didn't believe in them, but at that moment it seemed like I could feel their presence in the air. It was a cold energy coming from this creature. I knew I shouldn't have come here, but I couldn't go back. In the darkness of the night, his voice was unexpectedly clear, like an icy wind. "You shouldn't have come here, Warmblood." His words hung in the air, and I felt a chill creep over me. I stood there, unsure of what to do. What could you do in a situation like this? I took out the backpack I had brought with me and, trying not to panic, pulled out the garlic. It was the first thing that came to mind. Vampires were afraid of garlic, weren't they? I clutched the clove in my hands, trying not to show my fear. But as soon as I raised it, the figure in front of me jerked back. He knew. He knew that I wasn't just a curious girl, that I didn't just want to see them. I came here with a purpose, and judging by his reaction, I could make him afraid of me. However, before I could say anything, two more figures emerged from the darkness, tall, dark, with the same mysterious and frightening aura. They did not look human, and I began to realize that I was not facing ordinary creatures. My thoughts and fears were all mixed up. All I wanted was to just disappear. I almost gave in to the urge to give up and run, but I stayed. And there was something strange and powerful about it, a feeling that wouldn't let me turn back, despite all the danger that surrounded me. Fear clenched in my chest, but I couldn't move. My hands gripped the garlic so tightly that my fingers turned white, but I didn't care. The creature's gaze was piercing. It was as if they knew my every thought, my every feeling. And what was even more terrifying was that they were in no hurry to act. Time dragged between us, and I stood there, feeling the ground beneath my feet begin to feel fragile and unreliable. The first figure to appear on the bridge was tall, with jagged lines like a figure carved out of shadow. Everything about her appearance suggested she was not human. Those strange ears sticking out from under her hood were too big and pointy to belong to anyone human. And everything about her demeanor suggested she was expecting me. My eyes couldn't tear themselves away from this creature. It seemed frozen, but at the same time, it seemed to pierce the space around it. Its dark figure moved slowly like the wind silently sliding across a bridge. I knew that if it wanted, it could reach me faster than I could take a step. I sucked in a sharp breath, and it was cold, full of the night's dampness that seeped into my lungs, making me feel like an icy chill was seeping into me. I stood there unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react. All my experiences in this city couldn't prepare me for what I was facing now. It was more than just fear. It was a feeling I couldn't explain. A sense that I was in the middle of something that was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The second figure took a step forward, its movements as fluid and dangerous as a predator waiting for its moment to strike. I felt my knees begin to buckle, but I forced myself not to fall. Not now. Not in front of this creature. The third figure stood next to the first, and I felt the cold grow stronger. The fire in my stomach that had ignited my desperate determination died down a little, but I still held on. I had no plan. I had no weapon. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. And in that moment, I realized that I needed to find something inside me that I didn't know existed. I sighed, and realizing that I was taking more and more risks with each passing moment, took a step forward. My legs moved heavily, but I forced myself to overcome my fear. Thoughts swirled in my head about how to survive, how to escape, how to win. But there were so many that I couldn't focus on any one thing. I stood up straight, not taking my eyes off the creature in the center. It stood there, studying me as one studies weak prey, and I felt its gaze pierce my very soul. Its eyes were so dark that they seemed to absorb light, and there was no hint of humanity in them. They were black as the night itself and reflected nothing but emptiness. "Are you looking for something, Warmblood?" His voice came again, low and shrill like an echo of emptiness. I knew he knew I didn't know what I was looking for, but his words made me feel like he was looking right through me, and I could barely stand his gaze. I took a step back, but I couldn't continue. My head was spinning. The fear that used to burn me from the inside now became a heavy burden that I couldn't just throw off. And at that moment, I realized that I couldn't get away from these creatures unless I stopped being weak. I looked for a way out, looked for a way to free myself, but I couldn't find the strength to stop all this. I was just a human among people like them. My hand was still clutching the garlic, and I felt it begin to melt in my fingers, turning to dust. The power in it was fading with each passing moment, and I knew I could no longer use it as a weapon. But there was one thought that kept beating in my head. I can't give up. I looked up and met the gaze of the first figure. I don't know what moved me at that moment, but I took another step forward. It was a small step, but it meant something. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew that if I didn't move now, I would be trapped here forever. I couldn't let these creatures take my life. I couldn't let them win. The silence stretched, but nothing happened. I stood there motionless, and I felt the air around me begin to change. It was a strange, eerie sensation, as if everything in this place had slowed down, and reality seemed to shrink around me. Then, without warning, the first creature stepped toward me, and in that moment I felt a strange power appear in my body. I can't explain where it came from, but I was no longer the weak girl who sat at home and was afraid of the shadows. In that moment, I became someone else. The creature that stepped toward me seemed to be in no hurry. It moved slowly as if it wanted to see how long I could stand this tense silence. Its eyes were still absorbing the light, and even though it was only a few meters away, I felt everything around me becoming too small, as if the world was shrinking to this small point where it and I were the only participants. I knew I had to move, to take action, but at that moment I had no plan. My hand clutching the last of the garlic was shaking, and my heart was pounding like a drum. I tried to collect my thoughts to try to figure out what to do, but it was too late. Then it spoke. "You don't understand, Warmblood, how important your choice is." His voice was even, expressing neither emotion nor threats. He was not in a hurry, showing neither aggression nor fear. Everything was calm, almost ominous. I took another step back, but as soon as my foot touched the ground, another sound came from somewhere behind me. It was something that made me freeze. A strange rustling sound, like someone moving through dead leaves. I couldn't turn to see what was happening behind me, but I knew something was coming. Then I took another step forward. My mind was desperately searching for a way out, searching for even the smallest crack in this nightmare to get out. I couldn't let myself stop, because every moment was wasted. Every moment was precious, and I felt that if I didn't do something, I would stay here forever, in this web of fog and night creatures. "You think you're leaving, but you're already here." The creature's voice cut through the silence again, and this time there was a slight mockery in its intonation. I felt the cold creeping into my bones again, as if I had suddenly found myself in an icy void. I peered into the fog at these strange creatures with their merciless eyes that could burn me with a single glance. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't escape. Every step I took back, every move I tried to make, pulled me further into this maze. I was like a fly caught in a web, and every path I thought I had was narrowing. But I couldn't just give up. I could never give up. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. The words seemed so empty, so meaningless, but I couldn't remain silent. I had to fight somehow, even if it sounded stupid. The creature paused for a moment, as if assessing my words. Then I saw its body tense slightly, and in that moment I realized that the fear I had been trying so hard to suppress was, in some way, justified. It hadn't said anything, but there was something ominous in the air, something that made my blood run cold. Without waiting for an answer, I turned and ran. But the moment my feet touched the ground, I realized it was a mistake. The bridge shook beneath me, and I felt something grab my shoulders. It wasn't a physical touch. It was something else, something intangible. But it hit me with such force that I couldn't move. My blood froze again, and glowing figures flashed before my eyes. I was trapped. Everything around me darkened, and I felt the power of these beings become so real that I could feel it physically. The darkness that surrounded me became dense, like an ominous, foggy mass in which not only light was lost, but reality itself. The creature that stood before me moved to the same spot as me. It came so close that I could feel its breath, a cold, unpleasant breath that made me shrink in on myself. "You chose a path, Warmblood," his voice came again. But now I heard it not just as a sinister shadow, but as a real threat. There was something oppressive in his words, as if he knew I wouldn't be able to get out anyway. And worst of all, I began to doubt that I had to choose at all. I looked at his face and it seemed so familiar, but I couldn't figure out where I was seeing it from. The face was dark and menacing, but there was something in his eyes that made me freeze. It seemed to be waiting for me, and I finally understood that this was not just an accident, not just another encounter with a dark force. It was something more, something I could not yet comprehend. And what was most terrible, these creatures knew me. The darkness around me was thickening, and I could feel its coldness seeping into every cell of my body. My breathing became heavy, as if I couldn't get enough air. Thoughts raced through my head, but they were as chaotic as this nightmare. I didn't know what to do. With every step back, the world became more threatening, and every movement pulled me out of reality. I found myself in a place I had never suspected. At first, I thought I had simply been transported to another space. But now that I looked around, I realized I was not on the bridge or standing on that path. I found myself in some forgotten forest where the trees were too black and the air was thick and cold. I needed to remember that I was here for a reason. This was all part of something bigger, something I was meant to understand, and I had to find a way out. If only I could just wake up, open my eyes, and realize that this was all just a nightmare. But there was no ease, no way out, no escape. I took a few steps forward. My feet slipped on the thick moss, which felt cold and sticky. Images flashed like scars of memory that I could not break free from. Everything was connected. Everything was not accidental. And this creature, this something that haunted me, did not allow me to forget. I felt something tighten inside me, not just from fear, but from understanding. I wasn't just walking through a strange land. I was in the very forest I should never have entered. I had broken a taboo that had been hidden for centuries, but now it seemed the time had come for reckoning. Step by step, I moved through this darkness, trying not to think about what was behind me. This place was oppressive, as if the walls of this world were tight and the air was saturated with something ancient and forgotten. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in front of me. It was large, several times larger than me, and despite its silence, I felt its presence as a real threat. The creature stood motionless, but I knew that it was watching my every move. I froze, holding my breath. Images flashed through my head like lightning, pictures from days gone by, memories that had no place for this forest and this creature. I remembered everything that had happened before, and perhaps this was my salvation. Every decision, every word and look, everything led me here. Something made me move into this forest, and now I could no longer return. You have chosen a path, Warmblood. It was chosen for you long ago. The creature's voice cut through the silence again. I froze, my throat dry. I wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in my throat. What I was hearing sounded like it was part of something larger that I couldn't understand. The creature stepped towards me, its silhouette melting into thin air, and it was right in front of me. I felt a cold wind pierce me through and through, and I cringed in pain. I closed my eyes, trying to block out this unbearable weight, but it was impossible to escape. I remembered being warned about the shadow in the woods, about the ancient curse, about avoiding the forbidden paths. But why didn't I listen? Why did I keep going, even when the feeling grew inside me that I should stop? The creature didn't move, but its gaze was so powerful that I couldn't hide anything. It knew me like no one else. It knew my weaknesses, my fears, and now it stood in my way, forcing me to realize the whole truth. I couldn't help but realize that I had come here myself. My fault was not simply that I followed this unknown creature. I was looking for it. You came for something you don't understand. You were looking for an answer. But you forgot that you already knew it. His words penetrated me like icy rain, and I tried to hold on, not to give in to its power. I wasn't looking for you. I barely said the words because I couldn't understand how they could be true. You looked for him, the creature replied without going into detail, and you found him. I felt the cold swallow me even more. These words were not just a statement. They were a sentence, an answer I did not want to hear, but which was now becoming inevitable. Something inside me clenched. I wanted to believe that I could get out of here, that I could free myself from this shadow and find a way out. But the feeling of fear and the awareness of my own helplessness fell upon me so much that I could not move. I didn't know what was next, but one thing was clear. I was connected to this forest, to this creature, and maybe this path was what I was meant to take. The silence of this forest seemed unnatural, as if nature itself had fallen silent in anticipation of something great. The creature standing before me did not move, but its presence pressed upon me, as if an invisible hand were squeezing my ribcage, preventing me from breathing. I could not understand what it wanted from me, but I knew one thing. This was not an ordinary forest, and I was not here by chance. My thoughts slid around in circles, trying to find a way out, but each time I returned to the same point. I was here by choice. Everything that was happening was part of some greater game, and perhaps I was just a pawn. But the idea that I could go back, leaving these forests, seemed increasingly impossible. I took a step back, but the shadow didn't move. It remained in front of me, its silence as oppressive as the darkness itself. Suddenly, something changed in the air. I felt a faint, subtle glow, as if light was beginning to filter through the trees. It was a strange but lingering feeling that everything could change in the blink of an eye. You know what you've done, the creature's voice said. It wasn't threatening, but rather wistful. And in that sound, I felt something else, regret. It was as if it understood my pain, my struggle, and yet it remained in its silent observation. I tried to gather my strength. My hands were shaking and I felt cold. I stopped and took a breath, trying to get my feelings under control. I had to do something. I had to take control of my fear and break this cycle of silence because there was no more time. What do you want from me? My voice was quiet, but I spoke clearly. I couldn't let fear take hold of me again. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting what I was afraid of. The creature answered, but its words were strange, like a whisper lost in the wind. You do not understand that you came here for a reason. You chose this path, and this path leads to those who came before you, to those who were lost. I couldn't immediately understand what it meant. What did those words mean? Lost? I tried to remember what I'd been told before, what warnings I'd heard, but all I was left with was a painful sense of loss that I couldn't decipher. At that moment, I noticed a soft glow starting to emerge from beneath the trees in the forest. It seemed strange, not from fire or normal light sources. It was bright, but not blinding. I took a step toward it, and with each step, this glowing path grew brighter. And that's when I realized a path had opened up before me, a path that could lead me to answers, a path that was not of this world. My legs moved on their own, as if I no longer had control over my body. I followed the light, although part of me still tried to resist, asking questions that had no answers. How was this possible? Why wasn't the light in this forest normal? Why couldn't I understand what was happening around me? You will go, despite everything. I heard the voice again, but now it sounded like an echo in the depths of the forest. The creature did not move, but its words echoed from every tree, penetrating my consciousness. I stopped in front of the light. It wasn't cold like everything else. It was warm and soft, as if inviting me into its embrace. And then I realized this light was the very answer I had been told about. Something in my heart made me continue. I took a step, and as soon as my feet touched that glowing path, the air around me changed. It became cleaner, lighter, and even the forest, which had seemed like a living nightmare before, became less ominous. And then, for a moment, there were images before my eyes, shadows that seemed familiar, faces I had once known but could not remember who they were. Their eyes looked at me with sadness and silence, and I felt them pointing at me as if reminding me to keep going. I clenched my fists, hiding my emotions, and took another step. I had to find answers. I had to learn who I really was and what this path meant. And maybe this was all part of something bigger that I couldn't understand. But now I was ready to move forward. The darkness around me was beginning to thicken, and the light that had seemed so reassuring was now just a dim spot in the vastness of the night. The wind was rising, whistling through the trees as if nature itself had decided to protest my forward movement. I couldn't stop. Despite the inner fear that gripped my heart, something inside me was pulling me forward, forcing me to follow this mysterious, glowing path as if it were a part of me. The further I walked, the more empty I felt, as if this forest was trying to take away all sounds, all feelings. There was nothing alive in this place, only the rustling of leaves, the creaking of old branches, and a quiet whisper that could be felt but could not be understood. I walked along a glowing path, and with each step it became more and more difficult to distinguish where the path ended and where the abyss began. Suddenly the road ended. I found myself in an open clearing where only one stone stood. It was huge and mossy, dark, but there was something familiar about its shape, as if I had seen it before, in a dream or some distant memory. I walked up to it and traced my fingers around it, feeling the cold of the stone under my skin. At that moment, it seemed to me that the stone itself was radiating warmth, a warmth of strange, almost magical origin. Suddenly, the light disappeared. I stood in absolute darkness, and only my own breathing, which seemed loud in this silence, disturbed the peace. I tried to take a step back, but noticed that the road I had just walked on had disappeared. In front of me was only a stone and an invisible void. Suddenly, the flash of light returned. It came from the stone, and in its light I saw a figure. The creature that had been with me from the beginning was now standing right in front of me. Its eyes were glittering, and it did not move, as if it was waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart sank. The creature stood motionless, but its presence was so tangible that it seemed to fill the entire space around me. I could not tear my eyes away from it, feeling how, with each passing moment, a strange feeling was taking hold of me, a mixture of fear and invisible attraction. This creature was not alive in the sense in which I was accustomed to perceiving the living, but it was something that was impossible to ignore. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, but in the darkness, strange symbols began to appear before me. They were etched into the stone, and their shape seemed familiar, as if I had seen them in my most ancient dreams. In this darkness, everything around me began to seem different than before. Gradually, I began to feel that the space around me was changing. It was becoming different from what I knew. The air around me seemed to be becoming dense, saturated with an unknown force, and this force made me feel simultaneously part of something huge and helpless in all of this. With each step, I felt myself more and more captive to these unknown sensations. Every part of this world, every symbol on the stone seemed to pull me deeper, and I couldn't understand what was happening. But there was something familiar about it, as if I had experienced this moment before, but had forgotten its meaning. The forest, the stone, the creature, It was all a part of me, and I was beginning to realize that I couldn't get rid of it. I stood in the shadow of the stone, feeling something inside me begin to change. The light that had once been so bright now seemed dim and distant. The darkness had swallowed me up, and I could no longer tell what was real and what was just a mirage created by this place. I felt fear and mystery become a part of me, as if this shadow that stood before me had taken away all my senses. As the light consumed everything around me, I was left standing as if in emptiness, realizing that I could not return, could not get out of this web that I myself had created. The darkness was swallowing me deeper and deeper, but strangely, I felt no fear. I felt something unusual begin to happen inside me, as if my thoughts and feelings were blurring into a fog. At first, I tried to find meaning in what was happening, but soon I realized, here, in this place, there was nothing logical. This was a world that defied human concepts. Silence. It was so deep that I could feel it physically. My own shadow seemed alien, as if it were part of this vast emptiness. I tried to move, but my body didn't seem to obey. The moment lasted an eternity, but then suddenly something changed. This strange stone I had left behind became a source of bright light. I saw its surface begin to melt, as if the reality itself around me began to flow, absorb and dissolve everything in its path. The light became brighter, and the emptiness around me began to disappear. I felt the ground beneath my feet become solid again, and now I could discern the outlines of something familiar. My eyes tried to focus on the images that were beginning to emerge, but they were unclear, cloudy, as if I were trying to look at the world through a veil. Slowly, I began to recognize shapes and forms. The forest that had once seemed endlessly dark and strange was now filled with light, and I felt something real begin to exist around me again. My body seemed to come alive. I took a step forward and felt the earth beneath my nails, solid and tangible. Everything I saw was so familiar, yet alien. The forest, the rocks, the trees, all of it was part of the place I had once come from. But now it was different, as if I had returned to this world, but in a new state, full of tension and anticipation. Suddenly I heard a rustling sound, the same sound I had heard before, but this time it was different. It was familiar, as if I knew what the sound meant, but I couldn't remember where it came from. My heart skipped a beat. I turned and saw a figure. It stood at the edge of the light. Its outlines were not clear, but I knew it was something alive, albeit strange. The figure took a step toward me, and I felt that strange anxiety rising inside me again. I tried to move, but everything around me slowed down. Time stretched out, and every step I took seemed to be in slow motion. I couldn't understand what was happening. With each passing moment, the creature became more and more tangible, until finally it was very close. Now I could see it more clearly. It was human, but different. It wasn't alive in the usual sense, and there was a kind of emptiness about its being. Its face had no clear features. It was blurry, like a canvas that no paint would adhere to. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, and I had a hard time imagining that it represented anything at all. It was a void that simply took shape. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but I felt it creeping into me, like its presence was spreading inside me, taking over my senses, filling every cell of my body. I felt a cold sense of dread fill me, but at the same time I was powerless to resist. This creature was not of this world. It was something that went beyond anything I had ever understood. In that moment I realized it wasn't trying to harm me. It was just there. It was the beginning of something I couldn't even dream of. And at that moment, everything around me disappeared. All forms, all sounds, everything went into the darkness, leaving only this creature and me. I felt how it became a part of me. And again, I could not understand where I ended and where it began. Everything I knew disappeared, and only this strange, impossible feeling remained. Then, as if I had awakened from a long sleep, I realized that I had to go further. The creature, however, had not disappeared. It stood before me, but it was no longer threatening. It was simply a part of me, a part of this world. I took a step forward, not knowing where this path would lead, but I felt that it was now leading me not to an ordinary future, but to something completely different. Story 3. When I moved into this apartment building, I thought it would be like any other. It would have been strange if I had expected anything out of the ordinary from such an ordinary building. It was an 8-story building that seemed to be inhabited by people just like me. Students, young professionals, people who just needed a place to live. I didn't think the building would have any special atmosphere. It looked like a typical place to live in the city, with the same creaky doors, slow elevator, and gloomy lobby on the ground floor. Except that this building wasn't new, but rather a little tired. But none of that mattered. I was just looking for a place where I could live normally and focus on my work. I moved into apartment 5C, which was comfortable enough and cheap enough that I didn't feel like I was spending too much money. Over the first few weeks, I began to get used to my new home. The walls were thin, and if I were trying to have a conversation with someone in the apartment next door, it would probably be possible without even opening the door. But it didn't bother me anyway. I was mostly busy with work and didn't pay attention to the building's minor flaws. The building was old, but that wasn't something that mattered to me. I thought that I would eventually live here peacefully. But everything changed in the first week. It was a normal Thursday night. I had decided to study for a work presentation the next day, so I went to bed early. I was tired after a full day of work, and I just wanted to pass out. But at 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a loud, sharp knock on the door. It wasn't just a knock. It was loud and persistent, as if someone was trying to get in. I jumped in surprise. Who could be knocking at such a late hour? I looked out the window, but saw nothing. The room was in complete darkness. The knock came again, loudly and nonstop. I froze listening. My heart was beating too fast, but I figured it was probably some random incident. Maybe it was a neighbor who had the wrong door. I didn't get up, but then the knocking became insistent. It didn't stop. It was something strange. I felt the tension building up. However, I decided to ignore it again. Maybe I was just overtired or something was wrong with me. After a few more minutes of knocking, I finally went back to bed and tried to forget about it. In the morning, everything seemed normal. I went to work and thought nothing more about it. But in the evening, as I was walking down the hallway on my way to my apartment, I met my neighbor. She looked older than me, maybe 10 years. Her name was Claire, and we had never spoken before, but she seemed to be one of the people who had lived in the building for a long time. We exchanged pleasantries, and she noticed that I had just moved in. In conversation, I mentioned that I had heard a knock on the door during the night. Instead of simply brushing it off, as I expected, her expression changed. Her face went pale and she was silent for a moment. It was an odd reaction that puzzled me. She told me to be careful and advised me to avoid the apartment at the end of the hall, room 8E. I didn't know what that meant and asked her why. She replied that the people who live there don't stay long. With that, she quickly left. These words haunted me. Why was she so worried? What was behind her strange warning? I could have simply ignored it, but something in her reaction made me wary. After all, I was too skeptical and did not think that there could be anything supernatural here. I assumed that Claire was just trying to scare me. Maybe she was one of those people who like to tell scary stories about the neighbors. However, something strange happened that evening. I was walking home down the hallway, and suddenly I noticed that at the end of the hallway, there was a door that wasn't there before. The door was old, its wood looked cracked, and it stood out from the rest. The number on the door was barely visible, but I could still make it out. Écrit E. I was sure that this door hadn't been there before. I knew every corner of this building, and I had never seen a door like this before. Even if it had been there, why hadn't I noticed it before? My interest got the better of me and I walked up to the door. The handle was cold, and when I pulled it, the door swung open with a distinctive creak. What I saw inside made my heart skip a beat. It was an exact replica of my apartment. The same furniture, the same objects, the same interior. Everything was absolutely identical, but there was no life here. The room was dark and the air was heavy, as if no one had lived there for years. Everything around seemed frozen and forgotten. From behind in the far corner came a strange hum, like the sound of an appliance that had not been turned off for a long time. I couldn't explain what was happening. My legs gave way. I quickly slammed the door and jumped back, completely confused and horrified. What had I just seen? Why did this room look so familiar and yet so alien? Why was it empty and abandoned? All of this made me feel as if I was not in my world, but somewhere else. Strange. I ran back to my apartment and locked the door with 2 locks. The night passed in anxiety. I tried to convince myself that all this was just a hallucination or the result of overwork. But that strange sound, that cold in room A1E, all this remained in my memory like a shadow that does not give me peace. The next day, I tried to regain my composure. I thought that maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, caused by the recent stress and new surroundings. Sometimes the brain makes up strange things when you are tired and not expecting them. I focused on my work again, trying not to think about the events of the previous night, but it was all like a shadow that did not leave me. At night, when I was already preparing for another day at work, strange sounds began to bother me again. It all started when at 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard a knock again. It was as loud and sharp as last time, a knock on the door, purely mechanical, as if someone was knocking hard and relentlessly trying to get inside. That was the moment when fear began to overshadow me again. I sat in my bed listening to every sound. The knocking continued. It was hard to ignore, and at one point I even felt my fingers begin to tremble. I knew I needed to get up and check what was going on, but I couldn't. My body seemed to freeze. My heart was pounding, and there was only one word in my head: don't open the door. Finally, I made up my mind. I stood up, walked slowly to the door, and looked through the peephole, but there was no one behind the door. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Maybe it was just because I was too tired. But then I heard something else, a strange hum coming from the wall. I pressed myself against the door, trying to figure out what it was. The sound was monotonous, low, as if something or someone was hiding in the walls of the building. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but I felt that it was not normal. I went back to bed, and although I couldn't sleep anymore, trying to understand what was happening, the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. Soon this hum became almost habitual, and despite the fact that I could not explain its source, I did not dare to check what was happening in the walls. I preferred to stay in my apartment, hoping that all this would pass. The next morning, I decided to talk to the manager again. I was persistent and asked about room 8E, tried to find out more, but his reaction stunned me. He looked confused, even embarrassed when I mentioned this place. He said that room 8E did not exist, that it had never existed. I couldn't believe my ears. I was sure that I had seen this door. I had seen it in this hallway, but he just kept looking at me with a blank expression, as if he hadn't heard anything. After that, I felt a cold wave of doubt wash over me. Had I really gone crazy? Had I mixed up the floors or even the door itself? But something about it was wrong. I couldn't have imagined it. I was sure I was standing next to that very number, 8E, and I could see how the numbers had weathered. Even the paint had worn off. It was so real. After talking to the manager, I decided to go back and try to find something that could clarify the situation. I walked down the corridor again, and there at the end of the corridor was that door again. Exactly the same as before, with the number 8E, which could barely be seen, but now the door was closed, locked. I approached it, listening. A strange feeling came over me again. This corridor began to seem more and more alien and frightening to me. I knocked on the door. First silence, then a soft voice from inside. "I'll be out in a minute, just wait." The voice was calm and even, but there was a strange intonation to it that I recognized. It was Claire's voice, but she had moved out weeks ago. I was sure she no longer lived in this house. So what was that? How could her voice be coming from this room? At that moment, I was overcome with panic. I didn't know what to think, what to do. The voice I heard couldn't belong to anyone else. Without thinking, I ran back to my apartment. But the thought came into my head again. Why did the manager claim that room 8E didn't exist? It made me doubt everything I had seen and heard. Maybe this house was much stranger and more complex than I could have imagined. I started looking for answers. I reached out to neighbors, tried to find out about the previous residents of 8E, but all I got was vague information that disappeared like water in sand. The history of the building seemed to have been erased, as if no one wanted to remember it. All I could find were shadows of the past that had no beginning and no end. The more I looked, the more it became obvious that something was definitely wrong with this building. But what exactly? And why was it all starting to tie so closely to my own perception of reality? The next day, I was consumed with questions. Everything I learned only increased my sense of unease. At first, I thought I could somehow justify what was happening. Maybe I really was crazy, perhaps because of stress or fatigue. But then, as I began to dig into the history of the building and its inhabitants, doubts began to grow. I was almost certain that I had seen Claire. But if she had left, as the manager had told me, then who was standing outside the door of 8E speaking in her voice? The voice was so familiar and unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking right in front of me, and I couldn't find a way to understand it. After talking to neighbors and speaking to several people in the building, I discovered that almost no one knew Claire, or at least not as well as I thought. She was mostly mentioned as one of those neighbors who was never seen, never heard from, and seemed to disappear for long periods of time. I was not alone in my observations. Several other people mentioned that her apartment was always locked, and she was rarely seen by others. It was strange. All my neighbors had some distinctive features that I could remember. But almost no one knew anything about Claire. She was not in any story about the house. I thought about it, and I couldn't help but think that someone was trying to hide her existence. At some point, I began to doubt the very reality of what I was seeing and experiencing. Every night at 2 in the morning, I kept hearing the knock on my door. It was just like the first time. Every time I tried to ignore it, it became louder more insistent. The knocking sounded as if it was not a human knocking, but a force that knew exactly what I would not dare open. It was right at my door, and there was not a single night when it did not happen again. One night I decided to get up. I gathered all my strength, opened the door, and looked out into the hallway. But I didn't expect this. There was no one in the hallway, but the air was so thick that it seemed to be pressing on my chest. I looked around the space carefully, but it looked completely empty. The door to 8E was closed, but I was tormented by one feeling. Someone was watching. I decided to check if there was anything unusual in the neighboring apartment. I walked down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I approached Claire's apartment, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. My heart started pounding again. I didn't know why, but I was afraid to approach. This apartment seemed alien to me, dangerous. I didn't want to go there, but I couldn't stop myself. I approached the door and looked inside, but what I saw was a real shock. There was no one there. The floor was covered in dust, and I noticed strange footprints, as if someone had been there, but had left long ago. There were old stains under the fingernails, as if the apartment had not been cleaned for a long time. However, the air was cold, as thick as in the hallway. In the corner stood an old, worn-out chair, on which someone had obviously sat many years ago. The place was dead, without life, but despite this, I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. How could it be that in the apartment where Claire had once lived, there was no trace of her existence? And even stranger, what had become of her things? The furniture was old but not destroyed. There was some wallpaper on the walls, faded with time, but I could not find anything personal. The emptiness of this apartment was something frightening. In that moment, I felt like there was something bigger going on in that house, and that I might have been part of something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. Something wasn't just happening to Claire. The building felt like a place that held its secrets so tightly that no soul could escape. I returned to my apartment, but this time I felt like my legs were buckling. I had no desire to stay there. With each passing day, it became more and more obvious. I wasn't the only one who noticed the oddities, but when I went to the front desk to try to leave, the receptionist repeated the same words again. There is no such room. There is no R8E. This left me even more doubtful. How could he be so sure of this if I was so sure of what I had seen? I began to think that maybe this was the whole point of the situation. Maybe this house was just manipulating my perception of reality, making me doubt what was really going on. It was like this house didn't want me to know the truth. With each passing day, I increasingly lost the feeling that I was still living in the ordinary world. My nights were filled with fear and anxiety, and although I couldn't say exactly what was going on here, I knew one thing. I had to find out what this house was hiding. Fear became my constant companion. It permeated my nights. It dragged doubts along with it, giving me no peace. I could no longer be alone without immersing myself in thoughts about the strange room 8E and its mysterious history. Every time I passed the corridor, it seemed to me that the doors were looking at me. I could not believe what was happening, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw these empty walls, this wallpaper, and I felt they knew something that I had not yet realized. Everything I did, everything I tried to understand, hit the same wall. Everything connected to 8E had been erased. The people I tried to interview seemed to remember nothing. The stories they told me didn't add up. Some said they'd never heard of the apartment. Others said it had been empty for years, but nothing concrete. No details. When I went back to the manager to discuss 8E again, he just looked at me blankly and said, "Don't worry about it. There's nothing out of the ordinary." But I felt like he was hiding something. I was sure that something was wrong with this place. I decided to start by trying to find out who had lived in the building before. Peril Fan Shan checked old archives and records, hoping to find some trace of Claire, or at least people who could tell me something about 8E, but all I found were blank pages. Claire's name did not appear anywhere. Some people thought that she had never lived here. It all didn't fit in my head. Every day I continued to walk around the building, observing its inhabitants. It seemed to me that everything in this house, even the smallest details, seemed to be watching me. Sounds, rustles, even smells. Everything was suspicious. I began to watch the neighbors, trying to understand which of them could be hiding something. Several times I noticed strange looks, as if someone was trying to escape my gaze or hide in the shadows. But no one wanted to talk. I decided that I needed to understand what was happening to this house and its history. One day I met a man who could possibly help me. He was an old man, a former tenant of the house, and worked as a caretaker on the premises. He looked tired and sick, but there was something strange in his eyes that made me approach him and ask a few questions. At first glance, he looked unkempt and reluctant to respond to other people's questions. But when I mentioned room 8E, he froze and looked at me for a long time. "You shouldn't go there," he told me, his voice shaking, almost a whisper. "That place, it's not for humans. There's nothing there. But there is something. Trust me, you don't want to know." I felt a chill run down my spine, and I felt that his words were true. He continued to look into my eyes as if he wanted to add something, but suddenly he stopped and turned away, as if he had forgotten what he was talking about. I felt that he no longer wanted to continue the conversation, and I realized that he was hiding something. But what? I couldn't leave it unanswered. Everything he said gave me a new impetus to search. I couldn't live with this anxiety any longer. I decided to return to ADE and spend the night there. Maybe in the darkness I would find something I hadn't noticed before, something that would give me answers. The night was dark and thick when I approached the door 8E again. This time I was ready. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but I knew one thing. I needed to see what this place hid. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I just open the door or wait? At that moment, I couldn't think about the consequences anymore. I felt something invisible pulling me inside. I took the handle and opened the door. The room inside was exactly the same as I had seen it before, but now it looked even more sinister, even more dead. The thick air, the wallpaper that had become gray and worn with age, everything was the same as that first time, but now I knew that something strange was going on here. I slowly began to look around the room, but this time something in the air made me feel like I was not alone. I felt a presence, like someone was watching me. From somewhere in the corner of the room came a faint, barely perceptible sound, like a whisper. It was not the noise of old equipment, but rather a quiet breath that I felt on my skin. I couldn't stay any longer. I quickly closed the door, barely realizing what I had done. When I returned to my apartment, I felt worse. I felt the darkness I had seen in that room penetrate me, as if the very shadow of that place had filled my consciousness. I was sure of one thing. 80 wasn't just an empty room. It was a place where people disappeared, and I was next. Once I was back in my apartment, a strange chill came over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was hiding somewhere nearby, in the dark corners of this building. I didn't know how long I could stand this atmosphere, but I knew one thing. I couldn't leave all this unanswered. Fear was no longer an abstraction. It became something real, alive, and I felt it in every step I took. I thought again of the old man I had met at the door. His words swirled around in my head like a spell that I couldn't explain. "You shouldn't go there. That place, it's not for humans." I couldn't understand what he meant. He didn't tell me what was going on there, but his eyes, full of pain and fear, made it clear that there was something terrible hidden in AD. The next morning, I decided not to let things go as they were. I went back to the manager again, this time determined to get an answer. I expected him to say, "There is no such apartment," again, but this time I was ready to break the cycle of silence. I asked him directly, "What is going on with 8E? Why do you keep hiding this place?" He was standing behind the counter as usual, but his face had suddenly gone pale. He glanced at me as if he had seen something behind my back, and suddenly looked away. "You mustn't ask about this," he whispered. "Please forget about it." I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. Why was everyone so scared of this place? Why was everyone trying to hide its existence? I decided that now I had to find out what ADE was hiding. I started looking for any traces that might provide answers. Archives, no. Witnesses, silence. But I didn't give up. I spent several days searching the internet, looking through old records and documents related to the house, and finally, I found something. It was a strange letter that was dated back decades. It was written on old parchment with a sealing wax seal. The letter said that the building was built on the site of an old cemetery, and 8E was part of some original project related to ancient rituals. The fragmentary phrases indicated that this room was part of an experiment, and that its presence in the building was a mistake that everyone was trying to hide. With each new discovery, I became more and more afraid. It seemed that everything here was connected to something far more ancient and sinister than I could have ever imagined. I began to realize that this house was not just a place to live. It was something much more than I would have ever thought. This place had been built for a purpose, and its connection to the shadow of the past was becoming more and more obvious. One evening, when I came to the apartment after a long day of searching, I noticed that something had changed in the hallway again. At first it was unnoticeable, but as I got closer, I realized that the door to 8E was slightly open. My heart fluttered. I already knew that I should not go there, but the desire to understand what was happening was stronger than my fear. I approached the door carefully. This time I didn't hesitate. I opened it all the way. It was as dark inside as before, but now I noticed something new. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was hard to see clearly, like a shadow with no clear shape. I could feel its presence, like a fog that slowly fills the space. The room was silent, broken only by a faint whisper that seemed louder with each passing second. I stepped into the room, not realizing what I was doing. My hands shook as I tried to turn on the light, but the light didn't turn on. Everything was engulfed in darkness. The shadow suddenly moved. I didn't know what it was, a body, an image, or just my imagination. But it moved, and I was overwhelmed by the feeling that this figure was watching me. I tried to go back, but as soon as I turned around, the door slammed behind me with such a loud sound that it took my breath away. My hands were cold, and I felt something pressing on my chest. I turned back to the figure. It was standing right in front of me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Fear paralyzed all my movements. The figure suddenly spoke, its voice barely audible, like the whisper of wind in the shadows. "You came too late. You were expected," it said. And in that moment, I realized that everything that was happening was part of a larger plan. I was not the first to come here, and perhaps not the last. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I stood there as if in a trance, unable to move. From that moment on, I realized that the door 8E was not just a place, but a portal to something else. And I, like everyone before me, was connected to this place forever. Every night when I returned to my apartment, I felt a growing discomfort. It was as if the walls were becoming thinner and the atmosphere in the house itself was becoming oppressive. I couldn't get the words spoken by that figure in room 8E out of my head. "You came too late. You were expected." What did that mean? Who was expecting me? And why was all this happening to me? I began to feel myself slowly losing touch with reality. Every day seemed like a repeat of the past. The strange knock on the door that I had initially ignored now haunted me without ceasing. Precisely at 2 in the morning, it grew louder, more insistent, as if something lurking in the dark corners of the hallway was trying to find me. And it wasn't just a knock. It was something far more frightening. It seemed to echo in my head, making me wonder if I was going crazy. One night I woke up as usual from a knock. It was the same as before, but now I could not ignore it. I got out of bed and went to the door. I was scared, but I felt that I could not continue to avoid it. I opened the door and looked into the hallway. There was no one there, but something had changed. I saw how the dim light coming from the bulbs in the hallway was blurred, as if the world around me was slightly spreading, blurring its outlines. I couldn't understand what was happening, but this strange effect added anxiety to my soul. I heard the whisper again, light, barely perceptible. It came from the place where the door 8E had once been. I ran towards it. I didn't know what I was doing, but something was pulling me towards that place. And as soon as I turned the corner of the hallway, I saw it again. That same door that shouldn't exist. But now it was open, and I knew it was no coincidence. I walked forward, terrified that they were waiting for me. It was as dark inside as the deepest abyss. I tried to see something, but the light was so dim that I could barely see my own hands. And then I heard her, this figure. She was there, and her voice was clearer now than ever before. "You came again. You were supposed to come," she said, and her words echoed in my head. The voice was familiar, but not like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't human. It was something else. I felt a chill run through me. This figure was not just a shadow. It was part of this place, part of something far more ancient and sinister than I could have imagined. She took a step forward, and in that same second, I realized I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't obey me. I was trapped. My body refused to obey, and the only thing I could do was look. "You came for answers, but you are not ready to know the truth," the figure continued. I felt its words seeping into me, as if they were poisoning my blood. Then she took another step, and I felt a cold wind rush into the room. It took shape. The figure began to dissolve, its outlines blurring like smoke. "You can't leave. You're already here." Her voice became shrill and sharp, like stone on stone. I screamed, but nothing came out. Fear paralyzed my thoughts, and I didn't know what was happening. Everything around me began to blur, and I seemed to be disappearing, just like that figure. Then silence, complete silence. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in my apartment. I was in my bed, as if nothing had happened. But everything around me was strange. Everyday objects seemed alien. And the strangest thing was that the window through which I usually looked out onto the city no longer showed the street, but a dark corridor with dim light. I tried to close the window, but it wouldn't budge. I felt like this place was beginning to swallow me up. I felt like I was in another world, or at least a distorted version of it, and then I knew. I couldn't leave. This place had me, and if I didn't find a way to get out, it would swallow me whole. At that moment, I decided that I had to do everything to find out what this place was hiding. I had to find out what happened in ADE and why I ended up in this nightmare. I couldn't stay here, but I knew that the path forward would be even more terrible than anything I had experienced so far. I didn't know how much time had passed since I woke up in my apartment. Everything felt strange and distorted, as if reality had become liquid and I could stretch it or compress it. Reality was torn like an old sheet, and I found myself in the thick of it. Each morning was like the next, but each brought more doubts and questions. What was real? What was an illusion? I found myself back in the hallway, so familiar and yet so alien. I didn't know how I had managed to escape from that night's trap. Perhaps it had been just a nightmare, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Step by step, I moved along the hallway. My feet seemed to know the way. I wasn't alone. The walls whispered. The walls always whispered. As I approached the door, I felt that familiar chill emanating from it. It was open. Its slit, barely visible, seemed to invite me in. I stood there hesitating, and something inside me screamed, "Don't come in!" But what could I do? I couldn't stop. I was already a part of it. This place was starting to belong to me. When I stepped through the door, I wasn't in room 8E. This was another world. It was dark and slippery like the underground labyrinth itself, and I had to take a step back to understand what was happening. Room 8E wasn't just a room anymore. It was alive. There was more than just a shadow controlling this place. It was a living nightmare. I stood in the center of this strange replica of an apartment, but now everything was inverted. There was no light, but I could feel it, as if it were in the air, its density, its weight. I tried to exhale, but it was as if the air were trapped, like in an empty bottle. The walls, the ceiling, the furniture, it was all familiar but disfigured. It all felt like something forgotten, incongruous, as if reality itself were just a shifting shadow. The hum was there again. It was coming from one of the machines that I would not have noticed before. Now it became the center of my anxiety. I walked closer, and when I saw it, I realized that this was no ordinary piece of equipment. It was an object that looked like an old recording machine. It was covered in dust, and there was an invisible net around it. I couldn't tell what it was recording, but I felt like I had to turn it off. This was important. At that moment, I felt someone standing behind me, the same chill I had felt when I met the figure. I turned around but saw no one. Instead, I saw a strange blur, a fog that enveloped the corner of the room like an invisible cloak. I couldn't tell if it was just a reflection of my fear or something more real, but the feeling of presence was getting stronger. It was squeezing me. Then I knew I had to move. I rushed to the exit, but to my horrific discovery, there was no door. The same strange background sound I had heard before began to fill the space again. The sound was familiar. It echoed off the walls, giving me the feeling of being in a closed circle. I was locked in. There was no way out here. When I turned around, I saw a figure. She was standing in a dark corner, like an old shadow, and her eyes were looking at me with such intensity that I felt my legs begin to tremble. I knew it was her, the one behind all this. It was her voice, her image, her presence that was penetrating me. She began to compress the space with each step, making me become more and more helpless. "You can't leave," she whispered, her words cutting through the air like a knife.